listener production.
Hi, I'm Eleanor Harrison-Dengate, and thanks for clicking play on this Arvo's episode of The Briefing. Now, I want to take you back to the early internet, back when we were still connecting with dial-up, when MySpace was a thing. Basically, the internet from the early noughties.
I like rusty spoons. I like to touch them.
Remember that? If you do, it probably left you feeling a combination of nostalgic and creeped out. And if you don't, Salad Fingers was originally a video series launched in 2004. In its most popular video, which you heard there, the main character strokes rusty spoons because they feel nice on his lettuce leaf hands. It's been watched 45 million times. So Salad Fingers was one of the pioneers of early weird internet culture and influenced a type of video you're probably familiar with.
Hey, Charlie!
Hey, Apple. What is it?
Look at my horse is amazing.
2 decades on, and Salad Fingers is still going strong. It's gained a cult following, and the series is still being made. The latest of the 13 episodes was released last year. One Aussie academic has decided to write the first ever research paper on Salad Fingers. So, Jessica Balanzategui, who is a senior lecturer in media at RMIT University, thanks for joining us. First of all, why did you decide to study Salad Fingers?
Well, I'm very interested in weird YouTube content as a kind of artistic and aesthetic phenomenon, as a cultural phenomenon. One of my main research interests is also how platforms like YouTube mess up how we understand the difference between child and adult content. So for a long time, streaming platforms like YouTube have been transforming the way audiences interact with children's content versus adult content. Legacy media had much firmer boundaries around what the difference between those two categories was. And this article, yes, very excited to be the first published scholars on Salad Fingers. This is co-written with Cesar Albarán-Torres from Swinburne University of Technology. I think it started actually as a conversation about Salad Fingers and our weird nostalgia for this early YouTube phenomenon, this creepy animated cartoon that went viral at the very beginning of YouTube. So we both discovered we had some strangely comforting nostalgia for this very unsettling early YouTube content. So it kind of just took off from there, this research.
As soon as I looked at it, I was like, I remember watching Salad Fingers in the computer room at school. And now I'm thinking about it, I'm like, I would not have been an adult. So, I guess I'm really interested in, how you were talking about that sort of child versus adult thing. I mean, what do you think has sort of happened with that? Like, do you think there should have been some sort of regulation in place, or do you think this blurring of the boundaries is, a great thing?
I personally think young people and child audiences get unexpected benefits from watching creepy stuff. And I've interviewed and worked with child audiences to get some of this evidence as well, that it kind of expands media literacies and resilience with media content. So there are, I believe, some quite positive elements to engaging with creepy content as a young person. But there are also valid concerns around YouTube. A couple of years ago, back in 2019, there was some major controversies around this kind of disturbing content on YouTube that was explicitly child-oriented, like Peppa Pig or Thomas the Tank Engine kind of cartoons that seemed like they were just a clip from the show, but then they would devolve into Peppa Pig being tortured or Thomas the Tank Engine throwing himself off a cliff. There's still a lot of that kind of stuff on YouTube, because I think from its earliest days, and Salad Fingers, this weird cartoon by the animator David Firth, is an example of this kind of cultural place that YouTube holds. One of the pleasures of YouTube has been that it does mess with those legacy media boundaries and policies, classification frameworks that we have for TV and film. So that's long been a part of YouTube. So it's no surprise that seemingly children-friendly content that is actually not at all okay for young children. It's no surprise that that's really popular on YouTube, but it has only been really in the last few years that policymakers have responded to this problem. YouTube got a massive fine from the Federal Trade Commission in the US back in 2019, and now they have new policy mechanisms around how the platform works. So there's quite clear distinctions, or you're meant to make quite clear distinctions between child and adult content now. When you're uploading content on YouTube, you'll be asked, is this for children? And the platform deals with children's content a bit differently. But YouTube, like TikTok, like a lot of these user-generated platforms, they kind of get around these problems by saying, well, they're meant to be for people over 13 anyway. So if young children are on there and finding creepy stuff, then that's kind of the family's problem. So that's the way they deal with that sticky situation for the most part.
Interesting. Okay, so just sort of taking it back to early salad fingers, I mean, it sort of seemed to spring out of nowhere. YouTube turned up, went viral. Can you sort of explain a little bit about, like, where did salad fingers come from? How did David Firth sort of come up with this?
I think what you're getting at there with it, the way a lot of us remember just kind of stumbling upon salad fingers or hearing about salad fingers as this viral YouTube mystery, that has been a key part of its appeal. But it started out just before YouTube, actually, which is another reason I find it really interesting. And both Cesar, my colleague, and we find it really interesting for the reason that it started on a platform called Newgrounds, which does still exist. It's a user-generated community for artists to create and share stuff. That's been around since 1995. And so it was uploaded to Newgrounds in 2004 and then took off on YouTube a year later in 2005. So David Firth, this English animator, has talked about how he was delighted that Salad Fingers was made in a time pre kind of algorithmic strategy with platforms like YouTube. So the virality seemed to emerge organically around it rather than necessarily him having to game algorithmic systems on YouTube to get it to be viewed by people, which is a big that's the way YouTube tends to be used by content creators now, having to game the algorithm to get views. And he talks about being inspired by kids' cartoons like Rugrats, but also horror, uncanny, weird content. We pick up a lot of links in our article, aesthetic links to things like the films, the surreal art house horror of kind of David Lynch and the famous Pink Floyd film The Wall. So it's got this bizarre mix and had this intention from the very start of kind of childlike qualities. That seems to be David Firth's intention, and obviously it sprung up at a time when these user-generated platforms were building cultures around content like Salad Fingers that intentionally messed with those boundaries, because that's one of the key appeals, especially in the early days of YouTube. It's why the weird part of YouTube is so popular. It's not like film and television where there are those strict boundaries around what can and can't be done.
What all of these videos kind of make me think of now, which has become its own thing, is like ASMR. With Rusty Spoons, I was rewatching it ahead of this interview and I was like, oh yeah, like it had that, that scratchy quality that people like make entire videos that are just that for ASMR now. Do you reckon that there's an element of that in there?
I think absolutely. It's a very similar thing. It's a very sensory-driven cartoon. That's what we talk about in our article as well, but it's kind of structured by these sensory regimes, not a narrative structure that makes any coherent sense, which has long been what surreal horror, like the films of David Lynch, tend to do. I think Salad Fingers as a character and trying to efficiently describe Salad Fingers and what it's about and how it works is very difficult because it doesn't have much of a coherent narrative structure. But the fact that he's this kind of weird dude who seems to live in a post-apocalyptic world, alien-like, but also, as I said, looks like a child's drawing that just sprung from the imagination of a child. He just kind of wanders around doing whatever he finds sensorially pleasurable, like, as you say, rubbing rusty spoons, and which seems to give him some kind of erotic response. And so all sorts of perverse sensory pleasures. That's what we're following Salad Fingers in his day-to-day life, focusing on. And I guess we as audiences, like with ASMR and oddly satisfying content, are getting some kind of sensory response from that as well. Often it's an intentionally like Shudder type one. But the fact that it's all framed for the character Salad Fingers around his pleasure from doing weird things like licking taps and rubbing rusty spoons, I guess puts us into a weird headspace around senses that I think absolutely ASMR, oddly satisfying, they do a similar kind of thing.
What do you think it sort of says about our culture that Salad Fingers just got so popular? Then the weird side of the internet obviously like tapped into something that wasn't there. Like, what does that say about us?
I think the weird part of YouTube is interesting because of how, again, it is one of those tectonic shifts in how we imagine children's culture versus adults' culture. Obviously, for young people, it's quite liberating to feel like we don't have these strict limits being put around the kind of content that's acceptable for us. And also that, I guess, freedom to be using platforms like YouTube to just find the weird part. I know for me, it was personally a powerful experience finding the weird part of YouTube via content like Salad Fingers, because suddenly I was harnessing my own media choices and doing things that I'm sure my parents would have been very unhappy about if they knew the kind of stuff I was watching on that weird part of YouTube. But driving my own choices and making my own discoveries in ways that was like completely opening my mind to the dark, mysterious stuff that was out there. So again, there is an empowering element to that is really interesting about the weird part of YouTube.
That was Jessica Balanzategui from RMIT. And if you're like me, that would have brought up some pretty nostalgic memories from the early 2000s. If you're not and you haven't watched Salad Fingers and want to check it out, brace yourself. It's an experience. And that's all we have time for today. There is so much more over the weekend, though. Tom Tilley will be back on Sunday with a great chat with Patrick DeWitt. And Antoinette is here tomorrow. Antoinette, who do we have on?
I couldn't love this weekend's guest more. Well, it's her alter ego I love. It's Veronica B. She's an online social comedy star. And if you don't know her name, you might know your Auntie Salma, who has these really oversized big lips. And she's a caricature, essentially, of ethnic mums. She's abrasive, she's honest, she's hilarious. And I get to know about Veronica B's online journey. Many have assumed that she's an overnight success, but she talks through the hard slog, a decade slog in comedy before she really broke through online.
Sounds great. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this episode, tell your friends, like and subscribe, all that good stuff. And you can always get in touch with us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast if you have any feedback or story ideas. And have a beautiful weekend. My name's Eleanor Harrison-Dengate. Thanks so much for joining me.
Listener.